Somewhere around 1 million years ago, we lost our fur. Not gradually shed it like a dog losing a winter coat, actually evolved away from it almost entirely until we were left as one of the only mostly hairless mammals on the planet. Naked in the most literal sense by design. And here's the part that doesn't add up at first. We didn't start wearing clothes for another 800,000 years. Sit with that gap for a second. 800,000 years of walking around a planet with ice ages, freezing nights and predators, with no fur and no fabric. Either our ancestors were a lot tougher than we usually picture them, or something about that story is missing. So the obvious question is, what finally changed? The honest answer is, for a long time, scientists weren't even sure how to find out. Clothing doesn't survive in the ground. Stone tools last forever. Bones last for hundreds of thousands of years. Fabric and hide rot away in a matter of decades. So researchers had almost no direct evidence to work with, which meant they had to get creative, and one of the cleverest solutions came from something most of us spend our whole lives trying to avoid: lice. Head lice have been with us for as long as we've had hair to live in. But at some point, a separate population of lice branched off, one adapted specifically to live in clothing instead of on skin and hair. That means the moment clothing lice genetically split off from head lice is roughly the moment clothing itself became a regular part of human life. It's a strange kind of fossil record, written in the DNA of a parasite instead of in any object a human actually made. When researchers ran the numbers, the answer came out to around 170,000 years ago. Which on its own sounds like a reasonable answer to why did we start wearing clothes, except for one detail that makes the whole story more interesting. The last major Ice Age period began somewhere between 130,000 and 180,000 years ago. So far, this checks out. Cold weather arrives, humans invent clothes, problem solved, video over. But here's where it gets strange. Modern humans didn't actually start migrating out of Africa into the colder regions of Europe and Asia until about 100,000 years ago. That's a 70,000-year gap. Humans had clothing fully 70,000 years before they were living anywhere that actually required it for survival. Which means the simple, obvious explanation, it got cold so we invented clothes, doesn't really hold up. If staying warm during an ice age was the only reason, you'd expect clothing to show up right around when humans started living somewhere cold enough to need it. Instead, it shows up tens of thousands of years earlier, in a place where the climate didn't strictly demand it yet. One researcher who worked on this put it almost exactly the way it deserves to be put. It's surprising that early humans were tinkering with clothing long before they actually needed it for survival, and that tinkering ended up paying off later, when they finally did leave Africa for colder places. Tinkering. Not desperation. Not a population on the edge of freezing to death, scrambling for any solution. Just humans already wearing some form of clothing in a climate that didn't yet demand it. So if survival alone doesn't explain the timing, what does? This is where the story gets less certain and more interesting. A few different pressures were probably layered on top of each other, not one clean cause. Some of it likely was practical, just not in the way you'd assume. Even in Africa, nights get cold, especially at higher elevations or during certain seasons. You don't need an ice age to benefit from a layer of animal hide around your shoulders at 4 a.m. Early, occasional use for comfort and practicality could have existed long before clothing became something people relied on constantly. Some of it was almost certainly about protection in a more immediate sense, not from cold but from the world itself. Skin against rock, thorns, biting insects, harsh sun. A simple wrap of hide changes how willing you are to push into unfamiliar terrain, to hunt in dense brush, to sit on the ground instead of standing the whole time. Clothing isn't just insulation. It's armor against 1,000 small daily injuries that would otherwise add up. And some of it was probably social in a way that's easy to overlook because it's so unprovable and so human. The moment clothing exists at all, it stops being purely functional. It becomes something you can choose. Something that can mark who belongs to which group, who's earned a particular status, who's prepared for what kind of day. We have no fossil evidence of prehistoric fashion statements, obviously. But we also have no good reason to think early humans were immune to the basic instinct to use visible objects as signals to each other. We do it now without thinking. There's no clean reason to assume they didn't start doing some version of it the moment they had the material to work with. The actual evidence for early clothing-related activity backs up just how long this was a slow process rather than a single invention. Cut marks on animal bones, consistent with skinning, not just butchering for meat, show up at sites associated with much earlier human relatives, going back hundreds of thousands of years before that 170,000-year clothing lice estimate. Tools suited for scraping hides clean go back even further than that, which suggests people were working with animal skins in some capacity long before clothing became a genetic and behavioral fixture significant enough to spin off its own species of lice. In other words, this wasn't a light switch. It was a slow accumulation of small separate reasons, comfort, protection, maybe identity, that eventually solidified into something humans did constantly, not occasionally. And only after all of that had already been happening for a long time did the Ice Ages arrive to make it essential rather than optional. By the time humans were sewing fitted clothing with bone needles, somewhere around 40,000 years ago, clothing had already been part of human life for well over 100,000 years. The sewing didn't start the story. It was just the next chapter in something that had been quietly building since long before anyone needed it to survive. There's something almost backwards about the real version of this story compared to the version most of us assume. We tend to picture our ancestors as constantly one bad winter away from extinction, inventing survival technology purely out of desperation. But the actual evidence paints something a little different, a species that started experimenting with covering its own skin tens of thousands of years before it had to, for reasons that were probably about comfort and protection, and maybe even how they wanted to be seen by each other. We didn't invent clothing because the cold forced our hand. We invented it early, almost casually, and the cold just happened to show up later and make it permanent.